Who's Peter Thiel? What does he actually believe? Does he have clear ideological motivations or interests? What is this American technologist doing reading Nazi jurists like Carl Schmitt? What about his followers? Do they actually believe in coherent ideologies, or are they just opportunists? On today's episode of Techgnostics, we hope to shed a little more light on the mysterious character of Peter Thiel.
To help answer these questions, we're joined by our friend and journalist, Sam Venis. Venis's work on contemporary technology has appeared in the Point magazine about a variety of technological issues. Most recently, he's begun work on a book about Thiel and his attendant network state tech elites to describe what exactly these network states are by going to them and interviewing people on the ground firsthand. As we talk with Venis, we uncover not only what Thiel believes, why he thinks the Antichrist is in our midst, but also whether or not these ideas actually hold up to critical scrutiny.
We hope you really enjoy this episode, and we really loved getting a chance to talk with Sam. Thanks.
Thanks.
Sam, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your background and what work you're doing nowadays?
My background actually throughout most of my 20s was in business in various ways. I started off my career working at a consultancy focused on this discipline called strategic foresight. So basically, large companies would hire us to help advise them on how to think about how the world would change over sort of like a 5 to 10 year period, and which was super interesting. And but it's a little bit, flimsy, and there's a difference between kind of what you do, a report that you make for a company and a report that you make for, the general public. So I went a little bit further with that, and went back to grad school, studied cultural reporting and criticism. I got into focusing on technology and on sort of Silicon Valley, mostly because I had been in and around the crypto world for a long time, and I worked with some people in that world in my 20s and realized that there was something very important going on here. I have this moment. I was working at this publication called The Block, and I remember walking into the building, and a colleague pulled me over, and there was a group of people sitting there. They were like some Korean kids with bowl cuts, and they were all in their 20s. And my colleague points at one of them and goes, "Do you know who that is?" And I was like, "No, I have no idea." I was like, "Well, that one's worth $500 million. That one's worth $250 million. This is they've been working together for 4 years, and they've never met each other in person. This is their first time meeting." And it was one of these moments of like, holy crap, like something is going on here, and I don't really not only because the scale is so large, but also that there's a real culture around crypto that is intrinsically libertarian, intrinsically anarchistic, intrinsically at odds with the sort of like baseline assumptions of the liberal economic system. And so that kind of sent me on a path of trying to understand really what that was about. And I think also, another thing that was happening, this was 2021, the way that the mainstream media covers crypto and technology more broadly is like extremely oppositional and intrinsically sort of done from a perspective to like take down and treat people as stupid and a joke, and it doesn't really take their ideas seriously. And I think that comes at the sort of peril of the system more broadly, because the force of crypto in the world and the force, like, I think we've seen over the last 20 years, I mean, if you go back to the 90s, it's even bigger, but like over the last 30 years, we've seen one of the largest wealth creation events in world history through the creation of like the tech industry, and then more specifically the crypto industry. And every time that there's a giant wealth creation event that has a massive impact on the entire nature of the political system. And so my thinking sort of starts from the supposition that something important is really happening. And I think the network state movement is sort of as the manifestation of that shift is sort of why I once the network state book was published, I saw it and I was like, oh, this is important. And so that sort of set me on a journey of trying to understand exactly what was going on. And that sent me sort of around the world chasing down these crypto cities, trying to understand what's happening.
I just want to know more about that directly. Like, how did these guys make their money? Is it like arbitrage? What's going on in the network states themselves? So many questions. Like, I'll just ask it first. Like, what is the connection that you are seeing between the idea of a network state and cryptocurrency?
I would say that cryptocurrency, like, you have to understand that Bitcoin, like the Bitcoin white paper emerges in 2008, like right after the financial crisis, and almost in direct response to it. It mentions the financial crisis in the white paper, and it's basically, it's an understanding that the ways that the liberal system responds to a crisis is by bailing out its people, and it responds to the crisis of 9/11, for example, by increasing security, by increasing surveillance. And crypto, like most people forget that it comes from the word cryptography, or encryption. Like these are ways of basically, the Bitcoin white paper was intrinsically framed as a way to oppose the tyrannical power of the state that was basically directly intervening in in surveilling in the lives of its citizens. And so from there, it kind of, as it expands and as it becomes more of a political force and as more people gain wealth, it's become basically the backbone of the entire sort of political formation that begins to emerge. And so I think a lot of this gets lost in the discourse around crypto because most of the publication is about this absurd like shitcoin stuff. Like, you see just like these people trying to buy the US Constitution or Dogecoin, and so many of the narratives surrounding crypto are so absurd and ridiculous that you forget that, like, at least on some of the major currencies, like the money is real. A statistic that I've thrown around a couple times and that's often spoke about in the crypto world is like, if crypto were a country, it would have a GDP of about like $4 trillion, which would make it like about the fifth richest country by GDP in the world. This is a country that would have 30 plus billionaires and 240,000 millionaires, which is like a substantial political force. And so, you skip a number of years later, you skip to COVID, which became a really inciting incident for people because people were like, COVID became a moment when the cracks in the liberal order really began to crumble. It became clear that the health authorities didn't know what they were doing. There was all kinds of like arbitrary uses of power surrounding like national borders. There was like people viewed the sort of requirements to get vaccinated as tyrannical and not based on science. So you had this massive fracturing event where people who were already sort of skeptical, many of whom were very rich from crypto, were like, I don't want to take part in the system. The system, they viewed it in many ways as an apocalyptic event. And that was an accelerant towards, okay, well, how do we make zones that step outside of that and are an alternative so that as these forces accelerate, as crackdowns on people in crypto continue, as crackdowns on people who are involved in MAGA continue, as surveillance accelerates and the use of the state forces of the United States, like under Biden, people believed, begin like being used against citizens who have different political commitments. How do we make sure that we are not subject to that sort of like tyrannical force, and And that's where a lot of that energy was channeled into network states. And because their money, because many of these people are crypto rich, and because much of crypto money is not surveillable, and because there is an intrinsic belief that the internet money and the power of the internet and online technologies are the sort of third major power in the world besides the United States and China, it becomes a kind of like telos and mechanism to sort of have state authority driven by this power force that, you know, is sometimes described as Balaji Srinivasan, who wrote the book The Network State, describes it as the sort of the next great Leviathan beyond the nation state, and sort of invoking Hegel, invoking Hobbes.
I'm really invested in the way these people on the ground are thinking about these things, at least because I know for somebody like Thiel, who's studied, and somebody like Karp, also Alex Karp, who's studied these topics very seriously, they have a more capacious view. And so if we go about it that way, you know, we're coming at it from, I think, their bird's eye perspective. And part of my wonder in thinking about it from a ground level perspective is, are they representative? Like, is the average crypto person who's part of this 4 trillion thinking substantively like a Balaji I don't know how you say his last name without fucking it up. Srinivasan, I think. Are they thinking seriously with Hobbes? Or is this loss of faith that, Joe, you're pointing to something that only a more erudite Thiel recognizes? That to me is the pull as I hear you talk, Sam.
When Sam and I first spoke back last December, I remember, Sam, you were saying something like, if you were to call a shot, there was like 1 in every 3 people that you're encountering in this space were, say, real true believers, you think? Or could you speak more on that?
It changes depending on the environment, right? So I would say, okay, so for example, if you think about the MAGA movement as a whole, right? You've got this composite of this sort of Steve Bannon-led nationalist branch that, you know, is very concerned with immigration. It's concerned with manufacturing. It's concerned with the dollar system. And then you've got this sort of tech branch that is sort of like a new arrival to the MAGA movement, but was in many ways the decisive factor in putting Trump back in the White House, partly because of the amount of money that was donated by figures like Elon Musk and like Mark Andreessen, and the sort of promise of bringing those people closer into the fold, but also because of the sort of intellectual contributions of figures like Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel. And so within that movement, if you sort of click down into that group, you know, the people that surround Yarvin, for example, tend to be pretty ideologically driven. Yarvin had a tech startup for a long time called Urbit that still exists somewhat, although it's split into a few different forms. And Urbit people are probably, what makes them very interesting is that they are quite literary. So they're technologists, and they're driven by you know, they know how to code, they're involved in creating software and hardware, but they're also pretty engaged politically, both in terms of like Nick Land's thought and Yarvin's thought and Thiel's thought. But then there's sort of like the broader crypto world. And one of the things that's interesting about like Balaji, the people that surround Balaji, is like one of Balaji's sort of great innovations is that he's made the network state a project of relevance to the average crypto person, which did not exist for a very long time. So, you know, Curtis Yarvin was writing about, he wrote a book in 2007 called Patchwork, which argued that the future of geopolitics was a global spider web of thousands of city-state zone, tech-first city-state zones that would form a kind of archipelago. Nothing really happened with that under Yarvin because he's not really a very effective leader and he's not really an effective builder. Whereas Balaji, who is a technologist and who also already had a huge influence in the crypto world more generally, and also specifically in the Bitcoin world, was basically able to sort of create a version of Yarvinite, a distilled version of Yarvinite and Thiel's ideas that became pragmatic and focused in a sort of like manifesto that could get people involved. And he's been, one of his strategic moves has been using his influence in the crypto world to sort of collect all of the radical sort of like fringe projects into a coherent whole and take, basically develop something that's simultaneously appealing somewhat to people that surround Yarvin in the sort of neo-reactionary world. Some of the new rationalist people are sort of like become involved in it, but also the broader crypto community, so that you create a scenario where basically you have, a hostel owner from Belize or somebody running a digital nomad network, or somebody running a crypto coin or a crypto identity system that can feel part of the network state movement. And that's what's allowed it, I think, to in many ways achieve escape velocity.
So is Balaji, right? Is he, would you say, the most structural figure at the moment in terms of like you were saying that he's a really proficient builder of organizations, of social functions with regards to this culture?
I was going to ask about this actually. Yeah, for the people who don't know, like who is Curtis Yarvin? What's he done? What does Balaji do besides publish this book? I don't know.
Okay, so Curtis is I believe he's in his early 50s. He's been around for a while. He made some money in the dot-com bubble and then basically kind of like took some time to read, and he came out of this sort of like period of political incubation with two projects. One was a blog called Unqualified Reservations, and the other was a project called Urbit. Urbit was an attempt to sort of like rebuild the internet on the basis of basically like break the client server model and like on the model of sovereignty. So basically like you would host your own sort of node instead of having to like log into like a client server. And he wanted to rebuild the whole internet on that model. And his blog, which is actually what became the most influential, was basically like he's the founder of what's called the neo-reactionary movement. So the reactionaries in it's not reactionary as in like the reacting to stuff. It's reactionary in that like there was a long debate during the rise of liberalism, during the end of monarchy, basically, towards like whether monarchy was the best political system. And obviously we know who won that debate. But the reactionaries were people who pushed back against, who believed that monarchism was a better system. And so the neo-reactionary movement gets at the fact that he is a monarchist. He believes that the worlds and the governments should be run by a dictator CEO for all kinds of reasons. I mean, short-term political runs make it hard for people to have long-term insight. He thinks that there's a diffusion of that like technologists and technology firms are far more effective than political entities. Like, a question that's often asked is like, why can I go to most tech store, like most stores, and have a great, pleasant commercial experience, but if I go to the DMV, it's so shitty? And the reason he believes is because like, the impulses of commerce make the services of governance better. And then there's all kinds of other reasons that have to do with let's say I mean, sorry, I'm tripping up, but it's all kinds of other reasons that have to do with his with like the relationship between what he views as the true relationship between like most people and power, in that he believes that most people are already functionally serfs, and so the veil of democracy is only a sort of facade that makes people believe that they have political influence when they do not. And basically why he's become really important is that he has become very influential on figures like J.D. Vance and the Trump, in the MAGA movement in general. And so, as I said, this kind of like tech right that's become sort of central node of the MAGA movement more generally, he's like one of the larger influences in that group. Balaji is a kind of like later arrival. He made his money mostly. He's was an educator at Stanford. He's got a PhD in engineering. He made his money selling a genomics startup and a Bitcoin mining startup. And then, he became a partner at A16Z. He worked at Coinbase for a little while. And then he's been working on these network state ideas for a long time. He's sometimes, I don't know if he's a billionaire. He's often described as a centimillionaire, but I think when crypto markets are up, he's a billionaire as well. And he has been he's been working on these ideas of the network state for a long time. And he published this book on the 4th of July as a kind of like attack at like the basis of American establishment, and to announce the sort of like rise of this new kind of nationhood called the network state. And so over the last few years, he's really cemented his place as the kind of like key figure in that movement. So his ideas are many of his ideas are taken from a lineage of other thinkers, such as Thiel, such as Nick Land, such as Curtis Yarvin, especially Yarvin. But yeah, he's a very effective leader, and he's sort of a missionary of the Dark Enlightenment. And that's why a lot of stuff has started to coalesce around him.
I don't think we hit the Dark Enlightenment or Dark Triad. Could we try to like situate that a little bit? I know that's a hilarious term, but that is what they call themselves, right?
Yeah. Okay. So the Dark Enlightenment. I mean, I've heard different versions of this. I think that typically the Dark Enlightenment is like described as a merger of the sort of intellectual contributions of Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land. Nick Land is sort of the father of accelerationist philosophy, whose work of deep influence was primarily written in the 90s and early 2000s. He was one of the founding members with Mark Fisher of the CCRU at the University of Warwick, which basically, I mean, Fing Noumena is kind of one of the most difficult and captivating and interesting books of philosophy, I think, written in the 21st century. And I think is one of the most important books that the left needs to contend with in order to make sense of what's sort of shaping the world around us right now. But basically, the Dark Enlightenment, so the word comes from Nick. After he kind of went crazy, was doing a lot of meth, went crazy and moved to Shanghai. And after publishing Fing Noumena, and at a time when basically the left was becoming increasingly, they viewed the left as becoming increasingly tyrannical through things like the Me Too movement, through some of the more like peak woke stuff that was happening like 2018. The Dark Enlightenment sort of emerged. It was a book that Nick wrote that basically, it was Nick Land engaging with Curtis Yarvin's ideas. And so I met Nick at a party about 2 months ago, and one of the things that he said to me was very interesting. Like, one of the things that he said was that the Dark Enlightenment was a particular era, and it was like a project required of a particular era that was like trying to yank the sort of mainstream away from the furthest, what they view like radical excesses on the left, and towards like introducing sanity back into the mainstream. But that's typically not how I understand it. Like, something else that he said to me that I thought was really interesting is, I asked him, so basically he said that acceleration was to the Dark Enlightenment as liberalism is to the Enlightenment. And so to break that down for a second, so like, if the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that emerged in the late 18th century, depends on how you, but mostly around the figure of Immanuel Kant, originally Thomas Locke, and it was basically the development of certain kinds of liberal institutions. So liberal democracy, liberal types of science, liberal academic institutions. So if Enlightenment was the process of introducing rationalism into the world and using that as the basis on which to run society, and liberal institutions was the types of institutions that emerged from that intellectual shift, then acceleration, which is like Nick Land being the father of acceleration, is like in the Dark Enlightenment, sort of this process of the basis of the Dark Enlightenment is kind of drawing on, is like viewing the creation of a giant supercomputer and capitalism itself as a kind of sentient cosmic agent from the future that is shaping all of society. And acceleration is the process of like realizing that is a wisdom and a knowledge that's more advanced than the human species, and attempting to shorten the timeline to get there, out of the belief that will realize as something that the next stage of human evolution, or to even move beyond the human. And so if that is acceleration, then basically like the Dark Enlightenment is kind of like that intellectual movement, and accelerationist institutions are the kinds of institutions that emerge from the realization of that intellectual shift.
It's good to go over this just because it provides a little bit of literal and cultural context for the kinds of people we're talking about. Because when you mentioned Land, I knew we were going to get to the capital is a giant like space entity that is going to like absolve humanity via the singularity and all this stuff. And you could take that in all sorts of different theological directions and so on. But this provides some really important context, because then we can at least go into some of the literature that we were talking about with Thiel and kind of the role that he plays in this larger web. So I would say, Sam, could you give us a little snapshot on Thiel's literal presence as a person within this field? And then I'd say let's talk about Straussian moment a little.
And if I could just add, could we maybe juxtapose Thiel against Dark Enlightenment in this way? Because he seems to have a little bit of a difference of perspective. And so not just situating him in the web, but what's his intervention? What's he stand for, if not this?
Thiel is pretty sure he was born in South Africa, um, went to Stanford, and in 0 to 1, he kind of like describes his evolution as basically, I was a kind of conformist, so much so that he went into like the Stanford Law program, and he tried to apply to become to clerk for Anthony Scalia, and didn't get the job. And that he describes as like kind of this defining moment of his life, because instead of, had he gotten that job, it would have he would have continued on the path, and who knows, he would have just been a jurist. But instead he started PayPal. And his whole, contrarianism is at the very heart of sort of Thiel's ideology, sort of like seeing what other people don't see, and something he calls secrets. So secret being this kind of truth about the world that is difficult to see if you are stuck in the sort of like conventional ways of viewing things, like as exemplified by him being, at Stanford Law. And so, he starts PayPal, is obviously extremely successful. He's also known as sort of one of the earliest investors in Facebook. And he, oftentimes it's cited that like he invested in Facebook because he is a Girardian. And we'll get into this in a sec, but in the Straussian moment, like, one of the core ideas of Girard is this idea of mimetics, of people, of the idea that most people are sort of don't know what their own desires are. And so they learn their desires by viewing them in others. And he, in the sense that like, so I've seen recently that the like button on Facebook is in some ways like Girard's greatest contribution to philosophy. Uh, and so he invests in Facebook. Obviously that investment does extremely well. And over the last few years, he's basically become this kind of dark wizard figure, boogeyman to the liberal establishment. And I think that what's interesting about Thiel is that he's kind of all these figures, he is in many ways the most serious. I think that he doesn't write as much as Yarvin, and certainly not as much as Land, but he doesn't have this sort of like schizo break moment that makes them extremely skeptical. He seems to be simultaneously like very effective as a leader and really rooted in philosophy, which is what makes him dangerous. Because whereas like Balaji is really kind of on the extreme of like, he's a person who's taking ideology, but he's like really applying them. And if Yarvin is on the other extreme of being very much like an ideas person, Thiel is sort of like really this like philosopher king ideology. If the dark enlightened, he's kind of managed to turn himself into this figure that simultaneously can act and think. And, he's also a boogeyman of the liberal establishment media, because he took down Gawker. He paid $10 million to basically destroy Gawker after they revealed his sexuality, and he saw Gawker as this kind of like they exposed Hulk Hogan, a sex tape of Hulk Hogan, and then he basically he funneled money through Hogan to take down Gawker, which was like a huge obviously, it was a huge kind of scandal in the 2010s. And so what makes him kind of dangerous is that he's sort of he's in the shadows, and a lot of this is intentional, right? So like another thing that we can get into in the Straussian individual is like a lot of that the sort of thinkers at the heart of Thiel's ideas are Girard, Strauss, and Schmitt. And they serve different functions in his thinking. So from Girard, he learned mimetics. From Schmitt, who is a Nazi jurist, he learned basically that you have to pick sides eventually, that in politics, you have friends and enemies, and you need to the sort of apex. He has this line that the apex of politics is recognizing the enemy as an enemy, and from Strauss, he learned sort of being that you cannot say things directly. He learned the value of secrets. He learned the kind of reality that in a tyrannical world in which like you have to a group think is accelerated, which he believes our world to be, you can't say it, similarly to like a monk or an intellectual writing under the Catholic Church in the 14th century. You had to say, yes, I believe in God and God is great and all these things, and then hide your ideas within the text so that only a select group of people could really understand what you were saying. And so he believes that this is another Straussian moment, in that through his investments and through his writings, the point is not to reach a mass audience. The point is to reach specific people who can identify and with that ideology and break free of it in a Schmittian sense. And so he is kind of in some ways the orchestrator of, if there is a project of sort of secessionism in Silicon Valley or an opposing liberal democracy as a whole, certainly opposing certain types of powers within the United States, then I think Thiel is kind of the force majeure behind that movement, and that's why I think he's seen as such a boogeyman. And you see this with like, you know, almost every article on the tech right, you know, and it'll be like, and this is funded by Peter Thiel. They're constantly making a point of waving a flag to mention that Peter Thiel has funded this or that. And that's because I think they view him as a direct competitor and as the sort of like heartbeat of the opposition, the true opposition, not just like the Republicans, but the deep opposition, the spiritual opposition.
It's interesting because, I mean, I'm completely in agreement on the terrifying factor, mostly because just in terms of like the material that Shay and I were reading and becoming more familiar with in grad school and studying intellectual history or political theory, you know, part of this education was getting familiar with Schmitt, Strauss, I mean, Machiavelli, these other figures. And so I think to your credit, Sam, like the tech bro space is usually just chided and kind of waved away as kind of like a very childish, like resentful nerd thing. And I hadn't really actually listened to anything that Thiel had written until maybe a year ago. But even on watching the first interview and hearing him go through, just bolt through Schmitt, Girard, Machiavelli, you know, medieval Christian theological disputes. Obviously, like, this is a figure who commands a certain amount of respect as a real force, like someone who's going to be like someone who's not to be treated lightly. And if I remember one thing from our conversation back in December, it was that you said, you know, these figures can be ignored at your own peril. And I'm in complete agreement in that regard. So just to sort of situate the terms here, let's try to say, you know, let's try to first talk about, I know you were talking about with Schmitt, you were talking about how Schmitt is known as kind of this figure where you have to pick sides. I think just for those listening, we should try to define his work a little more. I mean, yeah, he was a Nazi jurist. It's really interesting. His context is a little interesting now because he's taken very seriously by the Chinese Communist Party, which is really pretty quite interesting. I feel like there's almost like you could like make a graph saying like, popularity of Schmitt and then reasons to be concerned in a liberal political space. And the higher it gets, it's like more and more concerning. Strauss, yeah, also from some very similar era, a very famously kind of like idiosyncratic, but also very conservative Jewish philosopher and legal theorist. Yeah, I mean, Shay, do you want to try to add some more definition to either Schmitt, Strauss, or Girard in these areas?
Yeah, I mean, picking up a little bit more with Strauss, this seminal essay of his, Persecution in the Art of Writing, is really, it's a way of understanding how anybody's written anything at all, how anybody said anything at all, not just in the medieval period, I think, Sam, as you're saying, and not that you were reducing it this way, because I don't think you were. I know that was just an example, but that everyone is always kind of playing this sort of game of hiding, and so it's not merely just a lesson that it's something you ought to do. It's something that everybody's doing anyway, so if you don't do it, you're going to get fucked. So this is the Straussian move in a way. And so with Girard, then, I think what's interesting about him is how he wants to treat Christianity as something like not just a summum bonum, but a sort of universal anthropology, that the notion of the sacrificial lamb, which is, of course, not necessarily endogenous to Christianity, because it exists in Abraham as well in the Old Testament, but it is the kind of thing that Girard then thinks is the sort of culmination of mimesis, that as we imitate each other, there's this sort of internal tension or torsion of the mimetic force itself that needs an almost, if we were speaking with Sigmund Freud, it needs almost a sadistic discharge, that this sort of internal violence that is bound up with imitating each other needs to go somewhere, or else society is doomed. And yeah, so I think one of the questions for me is, what exactly does Thiel think is doomed in this way? If we don't get these philosopher kings after his own name, what's to happen? We all become like slaves eating Soylent or something? What's the big bad that he thinks is gonna mess us up?
Maybe we should try to concretize this around the material and the Straussian element, because that's where he's really utilizing Girard. Right. So just to try to introduce the Straussian element a little bit, it's a paper, or actually, Sam, do you want to sort of contextualize the paper a little bit in terms of its like publication date and sort of his goal with it? I know that he's talking about essentially just the crisis of liberalism in the face of an illiberal religious opponent immediately post 9/11, correct?
Yeah, so it's published in 2007. It was first presented at this seminar of Girardians a couple of years earlier. And it's basically, yeah, I mean, one of the main claims that it makes is that basically the 21st century started in earnest on September 11th. And what it meant by that was like all of the kind of all of the institutions of the 20th century, from standing armies to borders to large sort of institution, like economic institutions, were thrown into jeopardy, because suddenly what it revealed is an enemy that basically like has different values than the West. A true religious civilizational conflict of a kind that the West had not seen since the Reformation, basically. And so, one of the kind of like basically, whereas, one of the kind of like main arguments that he traces in this book is the decline of the sort of real questions at the heart of political philosophy, and the rise of sort of Homo economicus as this sort of substitute. So he basically argues that like throughout, the Crusades, throughout most of the medieval history, questions of the good life, questions of the nature of the relationship between the city and man, city and God. These were questions that you went to war over. These were questions that that were at the center of all political philosophy. And so that kind of culminated during the Reformation, where basically the Catholic Church was beginning to decline. And what happened is they basically went on huge, that led to one of the bloodiest periods of German history, where almost, by some estimates, half of the German population was destroyed. And so one of the sort of arguments is that, in implications, is that we're kind of back in that sort of moment. So this comes in part from another essay or another book called The Sovereign Individual. The Sovereign Individual makes explicitly clear is basically it analogizes the moment that we're in at the decline of not just the United States, but liberal democracy and liberalism as a method of like societal control that sort of spans across countries like the United States, Canada, Britain, Germany, etc. Basically, like, it's arguing that whereas the Catholic Church in from, let's say, the 7th to the 15th century served as this kind of like pan-continental governance system that collected power through tithes and like managed the day-to-day lives of like individuals, like when you could eat fish, when you could have sex with your wife, when you could do, like, almost all of the social lives of people were managed through the church. And what happened in the 15th century is that began to collapse. And so the Sovereign Individual argues that as that happened partially because of the Sovereign Individual argues that happened because of technology. It happened because the printing press destroyed the church's control of information, the increased urbanization through increases in farming technology led to urbanization, which made areas easier to control. The gunpowder revolution made it so that there was a sort of like arms race that led to that made it so that like you have to only larger and larger fiefdoms could defend themselves and could engage in warfare. And so he says all of those, and it argues that all of those forces led to the creation of the nation state that replaced the church. And the claim of the Sovereign Individual is that Peter Thiel wrote the foreword to the 2007 edition or 2009 edition. The argument is basically that we're back in a moment much like that. And the reason is that the liberal democracy and the liberal West can no longer fund itself because its ability to tax its citizens is declining, and that crypto and capital markets spanning across borders and just increased globalization is basically declining, making that institution collapse. And so one of the arguments in the Straussian moment is that, like, as the last time this happened, when the church fell apart, it led to, as represented by like a competing church, which was the Protestant movement, basically led to one of the most bloody movements in European history. And so Thiel kind of suggests that we're back in a time much like that. In that, like, the liberal West, the liberal democracy is falling apart, and sort of a new system. I mean, in this metaphor, Thiel would be one of the vanguards of Protestantism, who's sort of who's sort of destroying anyway. And so the argument in the Straussian moment is that what happened at the end of the Reformation is that society agreed to disagree on questions of the spirit of man, in the sense that, like, where once it was important to address questions of the relation of the man and the city, the agreement in the West through the Enlightenment project was we're not going to ask those questions anymore. And so what replaced it was this model of the human spirit called Homo economicus, which was this idea that if you make life good for people. If you give people money, if you give them good families, then then violence will stop, essentially. And what he argues is that in 2001, with the arrival of 9/11, that the premise of that entire institution was proven untrue, because through the method of global terrorism, what was introduced was a civilizational conflict that had a completely different idea of man. It wasn't like, after 50, 70 years post World War II, of development programs that aimed to raise the quality of living in places like Afghanistan. This conflict came not from the poor villagers of the favelas in Brazil. It came from Osama bin Laden, who was an oil baron, who was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who was the recipient of tons of development, and that what this represented was a civilizational conflict. And so this is where the sort of Schmittian element becomes important, where he says, and so the West, the problem is that this idea of Homo economicus, this idea of the liberal West, creates a scenario where the West is unwilling to defend itself. It is unwilling to engage in a civilizational conflict because it's not set up to do so, because it's operating with the wrong premises. And so part of his kind of project in that essay is to claim that basically the West needs to sort of recognize what it's facing, that the first step in addressing these issues is to recognize the type of enemy that it is facing, and that in this new era that is much like the collapse of the church, where that is reintroducing these spiritual questions at the heart of humanity, at the heart, these questions of the human good are being raised anew, and that's what we need to, that is the obligations of this moment of philosophy, is doing that in a context when we have nuclear weapons, when we could absolutely destroy each other.
If we're looking at where Straussian moment puts us, we're in a situation where, of course, Thiel sort of describes the birth or the tension at place in the pre-Enlightenment environment, where the classical schools of philosophy are still interested in questions of the classic Platonic question of what constitutes human flourishing, structure of the city, the relationship between humans and politics, the nature of humanity, good, bad, corrupt, whatever. I mean, we're very familiar with the Christian conceptions. And to put this more concretely in the immediate sense, we're in a situation where liberal governance is dealing with its inability to deal with edge cases. And I guess for clarification, this is one really important place in which Schmitt this is where Schmitt basically becomes central in the work, where Schmitt in his books, the concept of the political and political theology, basically tries to argue that that politics, we should instead say that liberal governance is, in Schmitt's opinion, deluding itself into thinking that you can baseline political dynamics with liberal governance, like voting, legal institutions, and all these different sort of safeguards that protect us, quote unquote, from these questions of human nature, of like in the German case, the presence of the Eucharist in the host, or the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which of course leads to millions of people dying. But in this case now, the West, so-called, is contending with a force outside of this liberal framework, and Thiel is saying, in order for the so-called West to survive, I mean, literally in this case, it would have to sufficiently declare the Islamic world, not being totalizing in that sense, obviously, but to declare this enemy in this case as a real enemy with capital R in Schmitt's sense. The problem with this being, of course, that that in doing so, you have to then take up a stand in what it means, in what human flourishing is, or what the ideal lived life is. I know, just as a really quick aside, it's worth mentioning Popper's paradox of tolerance, and that it's pretty relevant to this framework. For those unfamiliar, Popper's paradox of tolerance is very commonly put on a lot of different infographics. But basically, Popper argues that a truly tolerant society does, in fact, have to remain intolerant of intolerance. The reason it's called a paradox is because it basically involves doing what Thiel is arguing has to be done for the literal survival of the West in this case, and thus it's paradoxical because a so-called tolerant society has to take existential force or lethal force or literal force against its enemy. I know Shay and I, you and I have talked about this a good bit, but I mean, I'm personally of the opinion that it's not really a paradox at all. You just have to bite that off. Like, a given society is about X, Y, or Z. And if you're going to have a tolerant society that is tolerant of the things that we're tolerant of today, an open, progressive society, you have to define what that is. And yeah, that is technically not philosophically coherent. At least you don't like, Popper wants to, in this case, have his cake and eat it too. So do you want to remain philosophically pure and allow forces in your society which are going to disrupt your claim, or the literal play-by-play free openness and progressiveness you have for on a social level, where we've fought long and hard to come to a progressive state of affairs concerning sexuality, drug use, and these all these different social issues that we've come a long way on in the last century. And do you want to give these up for the sake of this philosophical purity? I mean, I wouldn't think so. Now, Popper, of course, is trying to play footsie with terminology here, but essentially, I mean, from what I understand, Thiel is making a similar argument to say, well, maybe not necessarily an argument, but to say that we have to make a decision here in this case, at least for literal survival of the West. But in the Straussian moment, he calls it a Pyrrhic victory, because in this case, then and this is what happened. This is the problem with Popper's paradox of tolerance, is that if you really do bite off this terminology and say, the society that we're going to protect is a society which positively claims that we're going to protect the freedom of sexuality in our society, that is a value, as opposed to an open, just some sort of ad hoc open idea, which is the consequence of the current social milieu or whatever. That if you're going to keep that, then you have to undertake some sort of self-definition. You can't be agnostic about that. So let's say move on to the conclusions of Straussian moment and say, well, I mean, Sam, could you tell us more about what Thiel tries? What is the upshot? What does he try to actually do with this crisis?
To me, it depends on how you interpret like what the Straussian moment is for. I personally see it as both a confession and a personal manifesto, spiritual manifesto. And in that sense, I think that in terms of like the upshot, it is like the upshot is visible in his investments, and in the kinds of like writing that he's been doing. So like one of the things we haven't discussed it's like alluded to a little bit in the Straussian moment, but not addressed directly, which is like the whole idea of like the Katechon and the Antichrist. And so the Katechon is a Greek term that means basically like that which withholds the end times, and the Antichrist is sort of the figure that brings it that um appears to be appears to be the Katechon, but actually is like bringing about the apocalypse. And so this has become pretty central to his thinking. And so, like, as an example, like he tries to resist naming specific instances, but like, for example, he said that like Greta Thunberg is like the Antichrist, right? And so by this definition, like you have a scenario where like kind of like if liberalism is and progressive wokeism sort of like is moving in a particular direction that involves open borders, pacifism, that involves like all of the like pro-environmentalism without like just which Thiel I think interprets as like anti-energyism. Then you create a scenario where like basically somebody who looks like they stand for good values, that stand for like humanism, actually stands to create the destruction of things. And so I think that what Thiel is trying to do is simultaneously kind of like, I think he's actually kind of playing both sides. And interestingly, at the end of the Straussian moment, like he doesn't actually come to a really hard conclusion. Like it seems like he's pushing in the direction of, oh, well, we need to if we have a final enemy, we need to wage holy war, and Islamic terror is our opponent. And so we need to like wage a holy war on them. But then he kind of pulls back and says like, but actually in an era of like nuclear power, it's not really possible to do this because it just could like lead to apocalypse so quickly. And so he sort of hedges. And so I think if you look at the kinds of investments that he's made, like to me, it seems like, if you look at the investments he's made, like one of them is like investing in sort of parallel cultural institutions that provide an outlet for things like network states, for things like right-wing cultural phenomenon, like Dime Square, for example. It allows for like the return of, he's investing a lot in like deep tech and hard tech. So like technologies that work on the convergence of, for example, like the convergence of quantum computing and engineering, and like engineering of the physical world, or like applying computational biology to the cell and to solve like biological crises. He's investing a lot in sort of like in parallel systems, which on the one hand you would think of as a kind of like, it's sort of like it's a hedge against what he views as this apocalyptic system of the liberal West sort of like destroying itself. But then he's also investing in institutions like MAGA. He was one of the first tech people to support Donald Trump. And so a lot of this is kind of this idea of there's a very interesting sort of parallel between Schmitt and Thiel, where like, in the context of like the 1930s, there's this very interesting book called by Adam Tooze about World War I, where he argues that basically what Hitler was opposing was not just Jews. It was like Jews as an expression of American style imperialism. Like it was basically in a scenario where there had been relative power parity between the great powers of Europe for a couple hundred years. All signs pointed to a giant ascendance of America because of its like massive industrial base, in a way that was like very clearly going to disrupt the balance of power in Europe. And so opposing American imperialism became a way to basically opposed the sort of like pan-Americanism, pan-Judaism, pan-liberalism of the entire world. And so in Schmitt's view, supporting Hitler and supporting the Nazi movement became a way to stave off the apocalypse, which the apocalypse meaning kind of one world government, the complete homogenization of all culture, which they projected onto the American project. And so, Thiel, by supporting Trump, kind of like is in a similar position where it's like, the in a context where if Hillary is the alternative and sort of in the lineage of Obama, where we're in this sort of like pan-American sort of like total domination of culture and the subsumption of like at least in his beliefs of the entire West. I've heard Land describe it as the what is it, the converge the what's the word he uses? But basically like the flattening of culture, then basically the kind of Trump as this chaotic, schismatic figure becomes a mechanism, becomes a kind of Katechon for which to protect the sort of like domination and complete like self-annihilation of the apocalypse. He because he believes that the liberal West is going to eat itself. It is like the apocalypse will come through the mimesis of that sort of like flattening of culture. And so by introducing chaos, you can stave that off. You can withhold that from happening. And so there's a similar sort of gesture between the two of them. And so I think that like, in terms of the end of the Straussian moment, he doesn't reach it. It's not a, interestingly, it doesn't end on, and so let's go wage holy war. It ends on this kind of ambiguous framing of we need to do multiple things simultaneously and we need to hide it. We need to create parallel institutions. We need to support figures that appear like they're tyrannical, but in fact are not. In fact, are only tyrannical in the context of the types of schisms that they produce. And then we also, he's obviously, and then there's Palantir, which is like, and we need to, in a context in which the liberal West has responded to crisis through massive surveillance, we need to build our own surveillance mechanisms, ones that can go into parts of the developing world and basically predict what is going to happen using technology. And that's kind of, his biggest business coming off of PayPal.
I was going to say, in some ways, it all strikes me as almost extraordinarily contradictory. I mean, there's no real central node to anything he's doing. I mean, for instance, Trump will die. We know that. So then what? I mean, is the idea that some person's going to succeed him and, keep the Katechon continuously pushed forward until time immemorial? I mean, that is not a problem with which he seems concerned at all in any of his writings that I've looked at. And, like, is there a long-term vision in that way? Is there a coherence? Or is the lack of coherence maybe a feature and not a bug?
I mean, I think that you really have to root everything in grounding of like where in history he believes that we are, right? So like to come back to this idea of like the collapse of the church, right? We're in a scenario where if he believes that like the dominant mode of governance and power that has basically run the world for the last 250 years is being upended, and the way that it will respond to that crisis is with tyranny. So it will respond by clamping down on people that oppose it. It will become less and less effective over time, and it will make all sorts of like irrational choices. It will oppose progress. So it will oppose, for example, like he views the opposition of technology as an expression of the sort of like the dogmatism of the sort of like liberal institutions, and because like they are not the sort of like figures of the greatest authority. And so I think that if we come back, if we imagine that if you think about like that's the moment that we're in, right? Like, so how does the United States operate, or how would liberal democracy, like if the Democrats come to power, um, what will that mean for people like him? It will mean probably like attacking people who were in support of the MAGA movement. It could mean seizing funds. It could mean using the CIA and NSA and all of those mechanisms to basically surveil people that it views as an enemy. It could mean if ICE is the sort of like emergence of a sort of like national paramilitary force. Then and in some ways an expression of the kind of conflict between the MAGA movement and the rest of the sort of democratic movement. You can imagine those hostilities to accelerate. It could mean like the continuation of sort of like mass immigration protocols. It could mean that like commercial assets in parts of the world where America has typically had a military presence become less well guarded. And so this is where forces like Blackwater become increasingly relevant as sort of, paramilitary fortress standing in for what was once the American military. This is the world that I think he believes that we're going in. And then you add on top of that kind of like geopolitical conflict, unwillingness or inability to stockpile weapons to fight on the frontiers, in like worse and worse taxation, capital flight to parts of the world. So I think he's building a world that is prepared for a calamity. And so he's simultaneously trying to have influence inside the system, and through forces like MAGA to basically steer it back to what he views as sanity. So, cultural corrections. And this is a person who's made contrarianism central to their entire project. And so he doesn't mind being the boogeyman. In fact, I think he kind of gets a thrill out of it. And so there's because he's sort of quote unquote like out of the closet. And so I think that there is a contradiction, but I think that in the same way that like in finance, you have to hedge both sides of a bet to make sure that you're covered depending on what happens. I think like he is an investor and he's making certain types of decisions. It's just the types of decisions he's building on are not just financial, they're political and they're social and they're cultural. And so he's kind of he has a vision. I think the thing that unites him is a kind of interpretation of where we are in history and an idea of what is good and what is evil, and what appears to be good and what appears like, and what is the difference between what appears good and what appears to when is actually evil, like his sort of ethical framework. And I think that is revealed in the Straussian moment, and in terms of the actual like how to act based on that, he's acting probabilistically. He's not acting contrary to his idea that you need to have only fewer monopolistic bets. He's acting in some ways probabilistically, and trying to make sure that he can build institutions that stave off whatever collapse he envisions will happen.
It seems like getting a real answer about what Thiel is really advocating for is kind of out of the question. I mean, I would agree with you, Sam, in that he's mostly in the Straussian moment doing a work of like assessing the situation. There's no doubt about that. But I mean, can we chalk up his supposed libertarian associations with his, I mean, being involved with Palantir at all. I mean, like a national surveillance network. Like, how do we even square this with any mentioning of libertarianism, period? I mean, if we just want to say that he's playing both sides to be able to cover his ass, then, I mean, that's understandable. He's also a prolific businessman. So, I mean, that makes sense. But what do you think? Yeah, no, Shay, go for it.
If I could echo that question, what distinguishes him from just being a really well-read opportunist?
It seems like he's both of those things, I mean, I think that there's some patterns that you see as kind of consistent in his work. So I think that, like, his investment in, for example, like I want to point to two things. So one is he gave a lecture at the Seasteading Institute, which was sort of like a precursor to the network state movement that was like run by this guy named Patrick Friedman, who is Milton Friedman's grandson. And he's and where he gives this talk and basically he gives this thought experiment. And in the thought experiment, he says, how many countries exist in the world? Like, something around 200. How much freedom would there be if there were 50 countries? How about 2? How about 1? How about 1,000? And so his argument here is that basically, like, one of the things that he is deeply opposed to is this sort of like one world government, unification of the world under a global state, which is similar to Schmitt. And so I want to point to another moment, which is, I believe it was 2014, there was this very interesting debate between Thiel and David Graeber. And David Graeber, who's coming at this from a totally opposing point of view, but very similar in that Graeber was one of the most important figures in Occupy Wall Street, and he is an anarchist anthropologist. And Thiel is like an anarchist libertarian technologist. And they were both kind of like arguing very similar things, which was that the unification of the world, like if you look at institutions like the UN, the World Trade Organization, these were institutions designed for America to run the world under and with total control, to be able to replace governments when they don't serve their purposes, to be able to be given as many controls over trade networks, military bases, and the devices of sort of currency manipulation as it could, to basically ensure that a system of peace could be maintained. And if you believe that that system is about to collapse, and you simultaneously believe that a system that is about to collapse is going to become tyrannical and attempt to become even stronger, and it's going to use the forces of surveillance to accelerate that power, then you're going to want an opposing system that's under your control. You're going to want to develop political entities that are able to push the world further towards that scenario of 1,000 countries. And so I think that's how you can fit together this simultaneous investment in projects like Palantir and the investment in projects like the Network State and like Prospera.
So do you think it would be fair to say that for Thiel, opportunism is almost a deliberate method, something that he doesn't just take seriously being well-read, but that he really sees as something like a transcendental that he can keep in his back pocket and go about his business, perform his investments, and then at the end of the day, say very seriously to himself and his followers, based on my reading, based on my understanding, yes, this is the best way to do things. Almost like, effective altruism in the style of Peter Singer, but perhaps without the sort of warm-hearted, namby-pamby stuff at the end of the road.
I think like on the model of the philosopher king, sort of like statesman style way of being in the world, there is a kind of, I don't know if I would call it necessarily opportunism. I think that I mean, it is opportunistic for sure, but I think that he's an investor, and I think he is a political thinker and an entrepreneur. I mean, and I think like, what is entrepreneurialism? Like somebody brought this up to me recently, but like, venture capital, the whole like model of venture capital emerges from adventurers in the age of exploration. I mean, this is like, you want to fund an adventure to, some place in the West Indies. You fund a number of ships knowing that some are going to come back and some aren't with stuff. And the same sort of like model of funding a couple things and seeing what happens, literally like is rooted in missions to the frontier. And so I think like his entrepreneurialism is central to this whole project, which is of course intrinsically opportunistic.
So this provides a really good segue to get into, in terms of this opportunism, and particularly in the mention of venture capital. I mean, we should talk about his other major work, 0 to 1, in which he's, I guess, in this case, really talking about a concrete proposed view of economic activity. So from my reading of the text, or just from the initial reading of the text, he's essentially arguing that there are these two modes of civilizational advancement. We have 0 to 1 and then 1 to n, where n is simply iterations of the same thing in more places. So 0 to 1 to him is something like, and is a 0 to 1 event to him would be like the invention of the invention of the locomotive, or the automobile, or flight, or the cotton gin, or the steam engine, etc. I mean, the wheel, whatever. These things that introduce, or I guess, I figure that he connects this with his idea of finding secrets, that there are these sort of secrets hiding in wait that are necessarily technological, that once they are discovered and taken advantage of, unleash a whole, not just more, but a whole new type of civic activity or economic activity. And this distinction is what makes it 0 to 1. And so he's spending most of his time in the beginnings of the book decrying kind of this technological malaise of the late 20th century. So he's looking at things like the discovery of nuclear power, the invention of nuclear weapons, the moon landing in the late 60s. He's looking at these events as technology giving credit to the Enlightenment project, to the liberal project of this, well, maybe not so much in the case of nuclear weapons, but in this case, just some sort of like development of further vectors of technological benefit, benefit to human society via like flight industry, all these different things. And then he takes note that there's a malaise that happens from right around the 70s with deindustrialization in America and so on, and that we don't really have any major technological developments until really the internet, from what I remember him arguing. And he thinks that we essentially live, like, he's really fond of these diagrams in this book, from what I remember correctly, that where he always has like a quadrant diagram of various properties. So if you all can correct me if I don't remember exactly, but he says that there are concretely optimistic and pessimistic, and then also, what was it, technophilic or technophobic societies or something like that. But basically with regarding America, America in the late 20th century, that we are at most we become technophobic as part in the Cold War era, and we're also very civically pessimistic, and that we don't think that our civic problems can be solved with this technology. So and this is where he starts outlining a lot of his conversation about technophobia versus technophilia. And in this case, of course, him being a technophile, he's advocating for the use of technology to solve our civic problems. A very classic case of this, which I'm sure Thiel would chime in on the technophilic side, would be the Malthusian problem of population capacity in the world, where in every classic human geography course, you're introduced to Thomas Malthus, the anthropologist who argues that the world will have a limited carrying capacity for human population. And one of the main arguments against Thomas Malthus is the technological argument, saying that, well, hypothetically, we can invent technologies to increase the production of food by orders of magnitude, which has happened. And so to a technologist's credit, this is a demonstrated case in which a technology has, in fact, actually provided some benefit and warded off a possible civilizational collapse. So he also makes arguments in this text about the power of monopolies, which is really interesting. And this is really the main thing I'm hoping we can dissect pretty closely, that he essentially argues that he makes this really weird divergence from traditional libertarian positions, where a traditional libertarian position would argue that a perfectly functioning economy would be perfectly competitive in a sort of perfectly flat way, so that goods are sold at the intersection of supply and demand, and so on. Thiel argues that actually this is the perfect state of stasis and stagnation, in which point, in this state, no one actually has every single actor in a given market, which is under this state of affairs, is financially prohibited from making any adventurous moves and trying anything different, because they're making the least amount of profit from their goods, which are minimally expensive to the consumer and maximally expensive to them to produce. So then he goes on to argue that, well, actually, in a monopoly, you have, most importantly, a durable monopoly with forecasts of monopoly-like conditions for, say, a decade or more, that a given firm has the security and also the astounding profits by which to take risks and to try to invest in new ideas and discover these so-called secrets, these 0 to 1 moments. So I guess what I found interesting about that claim is that, in a way, he's talking about like a fiefdom. He's talking about like a durable, long-lasting institution which harvests a certain amount of wealth, like an insane amount of wealth over a long period of time, and has the means by which to do so in a secure way, and also and thus has the means to take extraordinary measures in a particular direction. And I mean, you could argue that this is technically true on a material level, but there's no warrant for at least my gripe is that there's no warrant for his conclusion. You can have a situation in which you have monopoly level profits over 10 or 20 years, but that doesn't guarantee that there might be a 0 to 1 moment unless you have a particular industrial or intellectual, tycoon or something who's actually interested in these things. And also, there's plenty of monopolies that, by their design, are actually not interested in doing anything unique or ingenious at all. I mean, you can just look at BlackRock or these organizations which demonstrably provide very concrete returns over a very long period of time by investing in extremely simple and stable and unvolatile resources like housing. At which point then you sell out a really key component of your society. So I know I've kind of gone on at length here, but Sam, Shay, how do we situate this whole like deification of the monopoly problem?
I could add one other thing. As I read the book, and Sam, you can correct me or fill in some details based on what you've read in addition to 0 to 1. When Thiel describes his attempt at founding PayPal with Musk, he described his initial ambition as really epic-making. He wanted a new currency for the internet, a new means of exchange for the internet, that would, in some ways, hopefully do what cryptocurrency ultimately did. Of course, that doesn't happen. It's a wallet that can store money, and yes, it's very, frictionless and reduces transaction costs and so forth. But so, even in his own writing, there's a sort of retrograde revision, or a retconning, as we sometimes say, about what exactly he's doing as a techno-optimist. He has these really great ambitions to go from 0 to 1 and to proselytize how we're to do this, but there really does seem to be a kind of disconnect in some ways about his own capacity to have done so, and what it is he really wanted that to mean. So I'm curious to know, from a deificational standpoint, from a proselytizational standpoint, like, what's going on here in terms of this sort of adamance about our ability to do this as human beings, independent of politics, independent of a money system that he ultimately still had to rely on and didn't replace, even if we're in the process of it, right? There's a real historical contradiction, not an ideological one, but there's the facts of his practice as an entrepreneur. They don't meet the standard of the deification he's proselytizing. I just want to know more about that. What's going on there?
Whereas the Straussian moment is a kind of personal, political, and spiritual philosophy for Thiel. I think 0 to 1 is kind of like his investing manifesto. It's much more pragmatic. There are political claims, but they're pretty surface level. He's not really concerned with politics here. What he is concerned with is, a lot of the context of this book is like, so he's emerged as a kind of important investor and thinker and entrepreneur. He's post PayPal. He's been asked to give these lectures at Stanford. And the context of these courses is like in the aftermath of the .com bubble crash. And so we're in a scenario where investors are becoming investors are becoming incremental in the way that they make investments. Whereas in the 90s, he lauds this kind of like pie in the sky thinking, and he admits that like sometimes it went too far. And he talks about like this scenario of like a friend who had 6 businesses at the same time and like was raising money for all of them and thought this was perfectly normal. And how like all of this kind of like collapsed. And so in some ways, like, if you have to ask, what is he pushing up against? And what he's pushing up against is an investment environment that is extremely conservative, that is unwilling to take really big bets anymore. And so I think like 0 to 1 becomes a kind of romanticization of the types of businesses where those types of things are possible. I mean, PayPal, maybe it didn't achieve the idea of like, a global internet currency, but it definitely tried to do that. And I think like he points a lot to Google in the book as like an example of this kind of like 0 to 1 technology. And his point is that if you look at Google, like, the reason that they have like 65% market share of the search industry is because they're just so much better than everybody else at making a search engine, and so like what Google did, what Netscape did, he points to a couple examples, is they basically like they produced something that, in creating like their mini monopoly, they created something that only they could do. And the monopoly was based on their ability to do that thing so much better than the other that the future returns on value allowed them to have kinds of the ability to make these strategic investments and take risks where like money is not the main, like, he has this line that's like, money is either everything or it's an important thing. And the idea is like, for a company that's losing money, money is the only thing. But for a company that's making so much money because they have a monopoly, it's just an important thing. It's only an important thing. It's not the main thing. And I think that but as it relates to monopoly, like I think like my main critique actually, and something that I think it would be interesting to ask him about, because I think that he failed to see it, is that he was also writing at a time of like, maybe it wasn't peak techno optimism, but there was a lot of techno optimism. Like I think like Google and Netscape and some of the Facebook and some of the companies that emerged out of that era, like if you think about like the appraisal of what technology could do and could be in the Obama era, it was very, very positive. And what hadn't happened is, in this kind of like bifurcation of monopolies into two classes, monopolies that basically like earn their monopoly by being so much different. And he as an example, he gives this scenario of, okay, so Google being asked like, what is it business? Okay, so it has a 65% market share on the search industry. But if you look at like, if you think about Google as an advertising company, it was something like 4% of the global advertising market or 3% of the global advertising market. So it's actually like, and so this is the type of monopoly that he's in favor of. It's the type of monopoly that's good at that like, you always have to open the size of the pie of like, what is it? What kind of monopoly is it? The irony of his model is that what happened in the 15 years since he published this, all of these businesses that he lauded became the kinds of monopolies that he hates, right? So like if you look at like Google, for example, like how does Google make its money? Like, I mean, it makes its money by preventing competitors from emerging. Apple makes its money by forcing every single person on the App Store to pay 20% of their revenues to it. This is exactly rent extraction. HP makes its money by forcing companies, by putting a chip in every single like element of a printer, so that if you try to replace it with like a cheaper alternative, or try to fix it, then you can get charged against the DSM, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA. This is where Cory Doctorow's argument about enshittification becomes really relevant, because basically, like, if the bad kind of monopoly is the rent extractive type of monopoly, then we've emerged on the backside of these 15 years into an and he has this belief that technologists and startups cannot become these kinds of like bad monopolies, but that's exactly what's happened. And actually, I mean, to me, this is my main critique, not my main critique, but one of my fundamental critiques with the network state stuff is that I think that we're bound to enter a scenario where this is going to happen. So, a lot of the main critiques of, the network state people have their kind of like laundry list of arguments about why the nation state is bad and doesn't work. Many of them have to do with, are very mirror in many ways, like the kind of like rent extractive quality of like the way that they extract tax, their inefficiency in using those taxes for social services, the ways that it limits citizens' ability to have voice, to impact the government. And so their solution is like, let's create network states, let's create our own version. It's going to be based on technology, and so they're going to be better. But like, as the example of the kind of like good monopoly that becomes the bad monopoly over time reveals, is that like there is a kind of like hidden pattern in tech development generally, where basically like as the sort of secret, as he likes to call it, goes away, these services become commodities, basically. Like the railway becomes a commodity, telco becomes a commodity, search services become a commodity, because eventually enough is learned about how these things operate that the relative amazingness of Google completely disappears, and the way that they basically maintain their supremacy is by rent extraction, is by blocking the gates, which is exactly what you see happen. And so can imagine this scenario repeating again. And so like repeating in technologicals, like, I mean, AI is bound to repeat this cycle. And in the most terrifying case of all, the network state is bound to repeat this case, because, like, you know what's more tyrannical than a democratic country that's become enshittified is a corporate country that's become enshittified.
I'm reading about this right now, actually. There's this idea from this philosopher of engineering, actually. So, Joe, you might like him. It's called William Wimsatt. He was at the University of Chicago, and he calls this process generative entrenchment. And the idea is that these sort of initially contingent secrets that, some inventor pulls out of his ass, comes up with, that everybody likes, eventually the ecosystem, market or otherwise, becomes so involved with these developments that they're entrenched. And so what was once free and contingent is now this necessary thing that everybody's coupled up with and has no choice but to do anything with. So it's a very systematic trend, not just in the markets, but biologically too. It happens with our organs and so forth. So it's a horrible, horrible pathology, but it's fascinating that he's picked up on it in this way.
It's a phenomenon. I mean, I think about this in part as a Canadian, right? Where, Canada is more socialist than America, but what Canadian socialism looks like is basically having monopolies of every single major industry. So there are 5 banks, there's 2 telcos, there's a giant milk lobby, there's only a couple grocery stores that like control the entire food supply. And basically it works this way because you become large enough within the Canadian infrastructure that you basically become a sort of state entity, right? You become a kind of appendage of the state, not only in terms of like tax incentives, but also in terms of just like your influence on the country, but also in terms of like your ability to extract monopoly prices and like, Bell, like Rogers and Bell in Canada, like literally provide they build the Canadian government rents telco infrastructure from the commercial providers. And that is a phenomenon, that's something that started, that's like, NASA renting SpaceX's rockets to send things to the space station. Like, that is a version of the same phenomenon. In America, it's more diffuse and more decentralized because there's just so many businesses. But a similar phenomenon exists. And I mean, I think like to call this, like, this is where I think there's a very interesting argument between, I forget who the political thinker was. It might have been Marvin Minsky, but the idea is that like under conditions of communism and under conditions of capitalism, the relative sort of like competition reaches a sort of equilibrium over time, and that is precisely because of this sort of phenomenon, which is why I think Thiel is lauding this like specific type of monopoly, and it's a flaw in his argument because it's basically the factor that he's not acknowledging is time. I think there was an ideology at the time that viewed software and internet technology as being sort of like of a new category of epistemological phenomena. And actually what time has revealed is that it's basically just infrastructure, just like everything else.
I agree in that it was also a very central critique of mine when reading 0 to 1, in that he's very cheeky with definitions of what constitutes something that going from 1 to n versus 0 to 1, in which case how can you really argue that there is a real 0 to 1 moment when human needs have been pretty static and the same since the beginning of history, whether that be transportation, communication, food, housing, shelter, medical care, etc. And at which point you can make the argument that every single one of these advancements is a sliding scale of improving the delivery of these goods. So I'm in complete agreement. I mean, we could get into that a little more, but
I kind of disagree, because there are fundamental changes in those factors. Like, for example, like the creation of the discovery of germs, and the creation of and the cell, and the creation of health protocols around medical care, and the increasing like soap and water availability in cities led to a 0 to 1 change in the longevity of the human life. In the same way that like the pill created a fundamental shift, like the birth control pill created a fundamental shift in humans' relationship to child rearing. The penicillin created a fundamental shift. Like, there are 0 to 1 technologies. I don't think everything is incremental. There are things. Google was like, he's right in saying that there are secrets, and that there is a world that there are, and I actually buy the argument that like certain kinds of monopolies are different from other kinds of monopolies. It's just that the long-term trend, put on a long enough time scale, those things end up commodified, and so the thesis falls apart over time, and new secrets need to be invented, essentially, to replace the old ones.
It's worth saying, I agree, those are absolutely 0 to 1 moments as far as the ones that you mentioned. It's good. They're very good points. I mean, do you think, does he acknowledge any sort of distinction in various kinds of monopolies in this writing, or is there anything that he speaks to that? I mean, what do you anything conclusive about that? I mean, I know you were talking about well, it is, I guess actually we should really quickly just stress that in the late 90s, in mid to late 90s, there was that culture of this libertarian culture associated with the internet, in which there was this idea that the internet was like the new Wild West of politics, of like decentralized communication, decentralized information sharing. So naturally, he would be a relic of this period of time, which maybe, in agreement with you, influences this, is where this optimism, as far as like this really dynamic 0 to 1 kind of moment, where this moment can come from. But to the original question, do you think he really makes any distinction or studies or elaborates on the nature of monopolies in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, again, we have to remember that this is a kind of, this is a kind of investment manifesto, right? So, like, if we look at, like, in the canon of Thiel work, like, what does this book, what function does this book serve? It is, it informs how he views the right sorts of things to invest in, the right sorts of people to invest in, the right, it's an argument on for techno-optimism generally, and it's a argument, it's a way of coaching. I mean, it's a class, right? Like, this is for students. This is a way of handing down information that he's learned from his years of working in the Valley into a kind of like methodology that other people there was many people who want to copy him and learn from him, what they can learn and how they can apply these lessons to their lives. And so, which he then immediately channels into Founders Fund, so like, which is about getting people to drop out of school or not take cushy jobs and go pursue 0 to 1 ideas. And so in terms of like the distinction that he's making, like it's a practical philosophy. It's how to be in the world, how to and in order to find, like, he emphasizes this, like how to find a secret is to be is to think deeply about the world that we're living in, is to be steadfast. Like, he has this anecdote that he mentions all the time, which is like why he thinks that people who are autistic succeed in tech more than sort of like more cognitively normalized people. And his argument is that, like, being mimetic, being like being too normal makes you extremely influenced by social pressure, and being kind of like autistic allows you to sort of like dive into certain areas a bit because you are like temperamentally and sort of like unable to read the cues of others, or not predisposed to read the cues of others as forcefully. It allows you to think originally and think critically. And so I think, I view it primarily as a practical philosophy and an investment strategy.
I mean, I think so far as it is one, it is certainly one that is remarkably total in its approach to just about any possible thing someone could want to do with their life, treating practically all situations in which one could find oneself as loci for investment, hedging, etc. And so in that way, there's something nearly totalitarian about it, if not in fact, then in tenor and in mood. And there's something very remarkable about that, aside from its being contrarian.
We're nearing the end of our time, but I would say, like, if we can't define him, I mean, we can define Thiel along a number of different ideological lines, but his actions, if all we can say is that he comes to sort of opportunism, bounded by a number of different philosophical sort of guardrails. I mean, is that kind of where we're left? I mean, I know that's obviously super simple, but maybe a different question would be to ask, like, can we be, like, does his position leave us in a place to be optimistic about technology's force in society at all? And I mean, that could be its own podcast episode, but I mean, where does this leave us feeling? Just to ask.
I think it's a pretty grim view on where we are societally. I don't think he's totally wrong. I do think that the sort of direction of the polycrisis and of society is heading in a potentially very dangerous direction. So I think, like, but I think also, like, I also think that I think it's ironically, to have a coherent moral and political philosophy is actually not only extremely rare of technologists, but it's pretty rare of people in general. And I think that what makes him such a force to be reckoned with, and the reason why he is such a boogeyman, is that he's putting his money where his mouth is, and he's like operating from a detectable moral system. And I think that, if somebody is not, if somebody is a madman, if somebody is like flawed in cathartic, ridiculous ways, in obvious ways, then you can just critique those things, or you can hope that you can convince them otherwise, or you can expose to the people close to them that they're operating with like in the ways in which they're operating with a misguided point of view. But the problem with Thiel is that the reason that he's able to produce acolytes among other extremely effective, intelligent people is that he there is a level of coherence, and there is like a very particular relationship between like ethos and praxis. And I think that it's to me, the way to like respond to this is by like, it's like understanding the kind of like hidden message. It's like becoming well versed enough to understand the Straussian message hidden in the rough, so that like the sort of language that's given in the stock in the investments becomes evident, and where possible can be steered back to sanity. Because I think that somebody's operating with an apocalyptic point of view is able to justify potentially very dangerous and violent things. And as a humanist, I don't want dangerous and violent things as much as can be avoided. So yeah, I don't know.
That's fair. I mean, we could try to bite off exactly what the hidden Straussian message is inside of all of his work, but I mean, maybe that would be a different discussion. Do you want to tell us just a teeny bit about the book on network states you're putting together?
Yeah. So I'm writing a book about network states. It's basically, I'm traveling around to all of the places where these experiments are happening. So Prospera in Honduras. I'm focusing on freedom cities in the United States. I've been to Malaysia, where Balaji Srinivasan is building stuff. And then there's, it'll go into the sort of the prehistory of the seasteading movement and charter cities movements, and also a couple of the projects happening in California. So a sort of tech Chautauqua town called Esmeralda, and another project called California Forever. And yeah, so it's going to be a sort of like intellectual history of these movements told through travelogue and memoir, of me sort of showing up to these places and going back and forth between anthropological sort of scene making and storytelling and character driven analysis, and then also explaining the sort of prehistory, so that you walk away with a real understanding of like what this movement is, where it comes from, and potentially where it's going. So you can sort of, and it'll be really fun and entertaining. I don't know if you guys have read my work, but it's tries to be very funny and make light of the scenario, as opposed to being all heavy in theory.
I read your piece describing your travels to Prospera in Honduras, talking about, I always forget his name, the guy who does the longevity work.
Brian Johnson.
Yeah, he looks like a vampire. I keep getting ads periodically, occasionally on social media for his like longevity mix. It is terrifying. It's genuinely unnerving. I mean, we honestly, Shay, we should do another episode or some sort of conversation on the body as technology, and we can plug like some sort of like body image concept in there. I mean, more specifically, longevity as a concept, because I know, Sam, we were talking about longevity as another the final frontier of moving past disease as a barrier to like human life and all this germ theory stuff. So regardless, yeah, Sam, please let me know, keep us in touch on how the book progresses. I'd be really glad to read it, and it's been a real pleasure to be able to talk about this stuff with you. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, same here. I'll echo the same thing. Thanks so much for talking with us about this, Sam.
Thanks, guys.